Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Foster, and I'm the account manager at INTIAL. Welcome, and thank you so much for registering today for today's workshop entitled Student-Athlete Preferences for Sexual Violence Reporting, a Discrete Choice Experiment. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded and uploaded on our website afterwards. Before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you experience any technical issues during today's webinar, please write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to assist. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the speakers in an effort to eliminate background noise. If you'd like to speak aloud, please feel free to use the raise your hand function and unmute. We will be holding all questions until the end when we will open up for a facilitated Q&A portion of the session. I'll now pass it over to Yan. Yan, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Health Preference Research Special Interest Group webinar. My name is Yan Ming. I'm one of the conveners of the HPR-SIG. Today, I'm delighted to have Dr. Ellyson from University of Washington to give us a talk. Alice is faculty in the School of Medicine at the University of Washington and the principal investigator at the Seattle Children's Research Institute. She received a Bachelor of Business Administration in Economics from Mercer University and a Master of Science and PhD in Economics from Florida State University, where she trained in applied microeconomics and econometrics, health economics, and law and public policy. After her doctoral degree, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in health economics and outcome research at the Comparative Health Outcomes Policy and Economics Institute at the University of Washington before joining the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine. Dr. Ellyson's research lies at the intersection of health, economic behavior, and law and public policy, with a specific focus on health risk behaviors, including interpersonal violence and alcohol and substance use among youth and young adults. The topic today is student-athlete preferences for sexual violence reporting, a discrete choice experiment. This talk will last 30 to 40 minutes with 20 minutes Q&A at the end of the session. The presentation will be recorded, but the Q&A will not be, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out for you at the end of the talk. Without further ado, let's welcome Alice.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to share our stated preference work with collegiate student athletes on sexual violence reporting. This project was funded by a pilot exploratory research project administered by the University of Washington and funded by the CDC. The RFA specifically called for community-based research with partners and engaged research collaboration. And so you'll see some details of that emphasized throughout. Our work was very lucky to be conducted in partnership with 10 Division I NCAA member institutions, as well as NCAA Research Division representatives listed here. Our partners were engaged in every aspect of our research strategy and design, and that includes the recruitment process, developing study materials, providing feedback and input on both the research questions as well as interpreting our findings. And they helped us both pilot and administer the studies that were part of this research proposal. Today, I'm sharing with you one aim from the full proposal, but there are other studies that have been published and are ongoing. I'm excited to introduce you to a group of scholars that are very important to me and a brilliant research team. As Yan mentioned, I'm a PhD economist. I really specialize in health and public policy, but most of my research focuses on health risk behaviors like substance use and experiences of interpersonal violence. And so I co-led this project with Dr. Avanti Arya, who is an expert in sexual and intimate partner violence. We collaborated with two other researchers who bring important specific expertise. Dr. Emily Crocious is an expert in health communication and health promotion, particularly among collegiate athletes. She also happens to be a former student athlete herself, and so can bring that experience. And then lastly, Dr. Devine Wright is an expert in medical decision-making and decision analytic methods, who also happens to be one of my mentors and a great teacher in some of the methods that we employed in this study. Overall, about 29% of student athletes have experienced sexual violence, or SV, since enrolling at their current institution. Sexual violence describes any sexual activity without consent or under coercion, and this includes things like rape, sexual assault, unwanted touching, sexual harassment, and stalking. Institutions of higher education with Division I athletic programs tend to have higher rates of both violence against women and sexual violence than those without Division I athletic programs. And SV has important health consequences. Sexual violence survivorship is associated with adverse health outcomes, including depression, suicidality, post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic gastrointestinal disorders, and cardiovascular disease, as well as other health risk behaviors like smoking, alcohol use, and risky sexual behavior. Adequate response and support after sexual violence is really a vital part of the prevention of these adverse consequences. Before support can be provided, a survivor has to make the decision to disclose. And after experiencing sexual violence, survivors actually face a quite difficult choice regarding both initial informal disclosure as well as formally reporting their experience either to their institution or police or somewhere else. Institutions of higher education have very low rates of formal SV reporting. It's estimated in a number of studies between 0 and 13%, and this has really not changed in the last 20 or 30 years. In addition to barriers that all survivors face, like fear of retaliation, stigma, and not being believed, student athletes may also encounter unique sport-related barriers. Sexual violence among student athletes is highly publicized. It might be perpetrated by a peer athlete, a coach, or a mentor in their sport. And consequently, student athletes may have concerns about the impact of reporting on both their team standing, as well as altered team dynamics or performance, or concerns about their long-term career. Understanding trade-offs in the reporting decision is really necessary to understand where existing systems can be adapted to make reporting a viable option for both student athlete and non-athlete survivors who need or want to report. These low rates of reporting aren't because survivors don't want to report, but often because they feel like they can't, or that it will be an unpleasant experience if they do. So the goal of our current study was to identify modifiable policies or procedures at institutions of higher education that could impact the sexual violence reporting decision, particularly among student athletes, using stated preferences. There are several reasons we chose to use a stated preference approach. Most are based on what data can be created or exists. So there are several factors to consider when analyzing stated versus revealed data. When I say stated data, we mean eliciting preferences, so asking participants in a survey or another designed study. Revealed preference data is often administrative data where we have existing data on choices that were made. So in terms of the areas where we need strong data, we want to make sure we have both availability of data on decisions as well as availability of data on reporting systems. In this case, revealed preference data doesn't really exist in the way that we need it to. There's no systemic administrative data that records experiences of SV and the reporting decision, as well as the institutional reporting structure. There are some surveys that contain questions about SV experiences and reporting experiences, but they often do not include athletic status, and they never include details on the structure of reporting systems. This means that for these two characteristics of data that we need to analyze preferences, stated preference designs can give us the ability to test and observe both trade-offs across different attributes in a reporting system, as well as the opt-out choice, which wouldn't be possible with other existing data. Next, we want to make sure that we have data without selection bias. Revealed preference data almost certainly suffers from sample selection because of the low rates of formal reporting that I mentioned previously. Stated preference designs can also suffer from sample selection, but can be mitigated through valid and randomized recruitment study protocols. Lastly, we want to make sure that we use data to analyze preferences that reflects real scenarios. Here, revealed preference data is obviously a very accurate reflection of real-world scenarios because it's data that captures choices that were actually made. DCEs, or stated preferences, on the other hand, might reflect real scenarios, but there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to make sure that they do. We chose to use a discrete choice experiment, or DCE, which is a stated preference method where we elicit preferences by presenting participants with a series of hypothetical scenarios where they're asked to choose between options with different attributes and levels. In our study, the DCE participants asked about the reporting decision. We asked them to choose the option they would prefer to report an experience of sexual violence. We used the Helter and Buller approach for attribute and level development, which is an iterative process of identification, selection and reduction, refinement, and evaluation. We first identified attributes and levels from prior literature on barriers and facilitators to reporting, policy briefs, documented policies across the US, as well as team discussions with our study team and our partner institutions at the NCAA. Then we conducted a series of structured qualitative interviews with 16 current and former student athletes. The structured interviews were used to iteratively assess whether the wording of the attributes and choice tasks were clear and whether the attributes adequately captured all relevant characteristics of the reporting decision. We assessed whether attributes were salient, non-deterministic, mutually exclusive, tradable, and independent. In addition to these standard DCE design elements for attributes, our study team really focused on attributes that institutions could control or modify. We continually revise the attributes and levels based on these criteria, as well as feedback and input from our interviews and the experts we were working with. After this iterative process, we created an experimental design with the final attributes and levels. We used a randomized balanced overlap design without blocking, which randomly generates choice task bundles until there is relative balance in the frequency each level is depicted. There were 124 different choice tasks that were created in this process. Lastly, we administered our survey experiment. First, we conducted a pilot test of the DCE survey with 34 current student athletes at non-participating institutions to assess potential violations of key DCE assumptions, confirm our definitions and our word choice, as well as estimate survey length. Then we did a full launch with our 10 partner institutions. Our final study design included 5 attributes, and I'll walk you through them now. First, substance use amnesty. This attribute specified that a reporter would not face disciplinary actions from their team, the athletic department, or their university if they reported an experience that happened while they or others were drinking alcohol or using drugs. There were 2 levels. The reporter will be immune or the reporter will not be immune. Next, we had an attribute that specified the likelihood of a policy violation finding. This was defined as the probability that the university determined that the person who harmed the reporter violated a code of conduct policy. This attribute had 3 levels, 35%, 50%, and 70%. Next, we had the attribute anonymous reporting. This attribute specified that a report would not include the name, address, or any other information that could identify the reporter. In athletics, this also includes the sport. We also let participants know that any identifiable information would not be required to submit a report and would not be made available to anyone once the report was filed. Next, we had the attribute survivor-initiated investigations. We told participants that this meant that they would decide if an investigation was started after they filed a report. The levels specified that the reporter would either have control over the initiation of an investigation or not have control over the initiation of an investigation. We also let participants know that once an investigation began, they would not be able to stop it and people would speak with others about what happened. The last attribute we included was initial reporting time. This was defined as the number of minutes it would take to file the initial report. We specified with the participants that this was not the time between when the experience occurred and when they decided to file a report, or the statute of limitations. And it was also not the amount of time that the entire process would take. Participants were presented with a series of 8 choice tasks from the randomly generated bundles that's similar to the one shown here on the right. Each choice task provided a pairwise choice of 2 alternatives or options, where the levels of each attribute for each option were randomly generated in the experimental design. An opt-out alternative was provided in all choice tasks because the option to not formally report exists in the real-world choice. It's shown here as none of these options. Participants were instructed to select the option that they preferred to report their experience to their university, where none meant choosing not to report. We had several hypotheses that were based on both prior research as well as our interviews and engagement with experts from the athletic community. First, we hypothesized that student athletes with prior SV experiences would be more likely to select the opt-out option than those without prior SV experiences. We also hypothesized that the value of anonymous reporting would be higher than the value of all other attributes. This was based on semi-structured interviews that we did with current and former student athletes. All of the athletes we interviewed included anonymous reporting on one of the top 5 most important attributes when we asked them, and it was never listed by any athlete in our interviews as being not at all important. Next, we hypothesized that the reporting preferences of student athletes would differ depending on prior experiences with sexual violence, their current competitive status, and whether or not they played on men's and women's sports teams. These hypotheses were based on prior findings in other literature, and in particular, the low rates of reporting SV at institutions. Our 10 partner institutions were randomly selected to participate and were all public universities with Division I athletic programs and an average of 475 student athletes. Because SV is common and any student athlete is at risk of experiencing SV and facing the reporting decision, all student athletes at participating institutions were invited to participate. Our final sample included just over 1,000 student athletes from participating institutions, which is approximately 21% of all student athletes at these institutions. Each participant completed a series of choice tasks and provided information about experiences of sexual violence since enrolling at the current institution. Respondents were compensated with a $10 Amazon e-gift card for finishing the discrete choice experiment survey. We estimated preference parameters using a variety of modeling techniques. First, we estimated fully dummy-coded models for all attributes, including attributes with more than 2 levels. We used more than one estimation strategy and compared fit statistics. These strategies included multinomial and mixed multinomial logistic regressions. Our mixed regressions were used to permit and assess preference heterogeneity in the sample. When mixed regressions were used, we estimated main effects only, where all attributes and alternative specific constants were randomized. To give you some more information about how we specified utility, the utility of choosing alternative J, given here by V sub J, for options 1 and 2, was a function of alternative specific constants, and then the levels of all reporting attributes from the DCE design. The utility of not reporting, the opt-out or J equal to option 3, was normalized to 0. This is to make sure that we account for censoring when people make the choice not to report. Our sample included 1,004 student athletes at our partner institutions. This figure provides a breakdown of demographic information about the study sample. Most participants played on women's sports teams, about 68%, and their current competitive status was on first team or a starter. That was about 62% of the sample. Almost 75% had a full or partial scholarship. The average age of student athletes in our sample was 20.5 years. And in terms of our sample compared to Division I athletes overall, about 2/3 of the student athletes in our sample were on women's teams, compared to about a 50-50 split in Division I teams overall. In terms of race and ethnicity, 7% of our sample identified as Asian, 15% as Black, 12% as Hispanic or Latinx, and 74% as white. Unfortunately, this means that our sample underrepresents Black student athletes compared to all Division I student athletes. We also asked about academic standing, which is given here at the bar at the bottom and is quite uniformly distributed, as well as sexual orientation identity. About 90% of our sample identified as straight or heterosexual, with bisexual being the next largest group at around 6%. We conducted model comparisons between the multinomial logistic regression and mixed multinomial logistic regressions, and looked for the model that minimized the amount of information loss by minimizing A1C and BIC, and also had statistical improvements to model fit according to the likelihood ratio test statistic. For this reason, we chose the primary specification to be mixed multinomial logistic regression with main effects only, again, where all attributes and alternative specific constants were randomized. The need for mixed multinomial logistic regressions can also be seen here. The standard deviations in darker Black text of all attributes except time were highly significant, demonstrating that there was substantial heterogeneity in the preference estimates for different levels of attributes between student athletes. This figure summarizes our main findings from analyses of stated preferences from the discrete choice experiment. The x-axis plots various attributes of reporting systems that could influence reporting, again, focusing on policies and procedures that we felt could be revised at the institution level. The y-axis plots the relative value or an importance score that student athletes have about each attribute. These importance scores were calculated by subtracting the smallest and largest estimated utility values for levels within each attribute, and then dividing by the sum of the differences for all attributes and multiplying by 100. Here, higher relative importance scores indicate a higher value to student athletes. In order of relative importance, student athletes most preferred high probabilities of a policy violation finding, the availability of substance use amnesty policies, reporting anonymously, and the ability to control whether an investigation begins after a formal report is filed. These findings suggest that our first hypothesis, that anonymous reporting would be the most highly valued attribute, isn't exactly correct, as it ranks third here in terms of importance scores. Notably, higher probabilities of conduct policy violation findings were preferred to lower probabilities, but there were diminishing marginal returns to utility for increasing levels of a probability of a policy violation finding. There was a significant difference in preference between a 35% probability of a policy violation finding and a 50% probability, and also a significant difference between a 35% probability and a 70% probability. But the relative change in estimated utility between 35 and 50% was 1.44, and the relative change in estimated utility between 50 and 70% was only 0.3. This suggests nonlinearities in the function of preference over probabilities, but we also could not reject the null of no difference between a 50 and 70% probability, which illustrates the diminishing marginal returns. We think it's important to note here that it's possible that a 50% probability is a critical tipping point for student athletes who are considering reporting. Our findings suggest the uncertainty about the chance that a report will lead to a policy finding violation may contribute to reporting hesitancy. We also hypothesized that preferences would differ by prior sexual violence experiences. Our team's findings have shown that sexual violence is prevalent among student athletes. Just under 30% of student athletes in our sample experienced SV since enrolling at their current institution. I'd like to provide a bit more context about these experiences before we talk about the results of our hypotheses. The figure here depicts the proportion of student athletes in our sample from the 10 partner institutions who experienced sexual violence since enrolling. The y-axis provides the sexual violence type, and the x-axis provides the sexual violence type, and the y-axis provides the proportion of student athletes in our sample who responded that they had experienced this since enrolling. Overall, shown in the bars on the far right here, more student athletes in women's sports, around 36%, experience sexual violence. About 13% of athletes in men's sports experience sexual violence. Unwanted sexual touch was the most common sexual violence experience, but around 10% of student athletes playing on women's teams experienced stalking, attempted sexual assault, and sexual assault or rape. To assess whether prior sexual violence experiences influence the reporting decision and preferences for sexual violence reporting attributes, we interacted each attribute with a binary indicator for any prior sexual violence experience at their current institution. The figure here provides the estimated mean utility, the height of the bar, plus or minus a 1 standard deviation estimate from the mixed multinomial logistic regression, which is the error bar, for 2 separate groups: athletes with prior SV experiences, marked by SV under each attribute level, and athletes without prior SV experiences, marked with no SV under each attribute level. There were some notable differences between student athletes with and without prior sexual violence experiences at their current institution. First, student athletes with prior experiences were statistically significantly more likely to select the opt-out in the DCE paired choice. The figure here shows our other main findings. Athletes with prior experiences had a lower estimated mean utility for all attribute levels than their peers who had not experienced sexual violence. In addition, athletes with prior SV experiences had less between-person heterogeneity than those without prior experiences, which is demonstrated by the more narrow width of the error bars for athletes with prior SV experiences. And lastly, the relative importance of the attributes changed when the attribute levels were interacted with prior SV experiences. You can see that here in the figure provided. In terms of relative importance, the most important attribute for student athletes with prior sexual violence experiences was the availability of substance use amnesty policies, followed by anonymous reporting and survivor-initiated investigations, and lastly, the probability of a policy violation finding. You can see here that the relative importance of the probability of a policy violation finding was actually much lower among participants with prior SV experiences. We also hypothesized that sport-related factors, including competitive status and playing on men's or women's sports teams, would also be associated with changes in preferences about SV reporting. We explored how athletic-specific factors impact reporting preferences by interacting each attribute level with a different binary indicator. Here, one that indicated whether an athlete played on men's or women's sports teams. The top panel shows the mean estimated utility plus or minus 1 standard deviation in the error bars from our primary mixed multinomial logistic regressions among all athletes. The bottom panel shows the same regression specification, but with our interaction for men's or women's sports teams. In general, mean utility was much more precisely estimated. There was less variability in preferences, and there were slightly lower estimated utility values among student athletes playing on women's sports teams compared to men's sport teams. The men's sports teams estimates actually mirror our overall sample, whereas the estimates for athletes playing on women's sports teams much more closely mimic those that are found when we interact with prior sexual violence experiences. This is likely in part because the prevalence of sexual violence tends to be higher among cis women, as well as trans and non-binary athletes. It's important to note here that the NCAA and athletics generally segments sports teams into men's and women's. This means that men's and women's teams might include both trans and non-binary athletes. You can see here that the relative importance also differs by men's and women's sports teams. The relative importance of each attribute for student athletes playing on men's sports teams is actually most similar to the findings for the overall sample, shown here in the darker and lighter shaded blue bars. First, the probability of a policy violation finding. Next, substance use amnesty. And then lastly, close importance scores for survivor-initiated investigations and anonymous reporting. However, the relative importance of each attribute for student athletes playing on women's sports teams was most similar to the findings among student athletes with prior sexual violence experiences. First, substance use amnesty, followed closely by anonymous reporting, and then very close importance scores for the probability of a policy violation finding and survivor-initiated investigations. Next, we assess the impact of competitive status. The bottom panel shows the main regression specification, this time interacted with a binary indicator for whether the athlete played on first team or another competitive status. For those of you who aren't familiar with athletics, first team often means they're a starter or they are competing at the highest level of their sport. Among student athletes on first team, you can see here in the yellow bars that none of the attribute levels had an estimated utility that was significantly different from 0. This suggests little to no influence of these attributes on the SV reporting decision for athletes at the highest levels of competition. Other competitive statuses, though, much more closely mirror the results from our main specification. Our results were robust to several internal validity evaluations. First, we re-estimated all models, excluding participants who failed the within set dominated pair by selecting a strictly dominated alternative. This was only about 9% of our sample, or 92 participants, but our results were robust to excluding these participants. Most of the sample, about 85%, indicated that it was a little difficult to choose between the reporting options. This is important because we want to make sure that the choice that we're asking people to make requires trade-offs. We re-estimated all models, excluding any individuals who indicated it was not at all difficult to complete the choice tasks, and our primary results were also robust to the sensitivity analysis. Lastly, we wanted to query for other important factors. Because there isn't a lot of research in the preferences of sexual violence reporting structures, we wanted to make sure that our DCE was including all attributes that might be identified by participants. Most student athletes in the study, over 91%, indicated that the choice tasks in the DCE fully captured all relevant attributes for their reporting decision. The most commonly listed factors among the remaining participants who said there was something that was missing, which was about 8.5%, indicated the severity of the incident, the relationship with the perpetrator, and the gender alignment with the report recipient. However, these factors were addressed in the DCE instructions, where participants were instructed to assume the experience and the persons involved were the same for each scenario and reporting option. We did consider the report recipient in the course of qualitative interviews with student athletes, but we ultimately excluded this attribute because of the very large number of levels that would be required to fully capture all report recipients at universities. In addition, in all discussions with student athletes and in the open-ended survey responses, the attribute when mentioned was very unique to the student athlete and their pre-existing relationships with these personnel. Notably, the level of punishment or specific consequences for the individual who violated a sexual violence conduct policy was not identified as an important factor in the initial reporting decision. That means that the decision to report may largely hinge on whether a survivor expects a report to validate their experience by providing a finding of conduct violation rather than any particular punishment on the person they report. In an original analysis plan, we also intended to estimate willingness to spend time on an initial report. Several studies have characterized trade-offs in decisions using willingness to wait or willingness to travel in time as a quantifiable opportunity cost for choices where monetary costs are not involved. This is similar to similar to sexual violence reporting, where there is an opportunity cost, particularly of your time, for reporting. Willingness to spend time on an initial report would represent how much time student athletes were willing to spend on a report for a given attribute level. When we do willingness to pay or willingness to spend time, we want to make sure that they're an accurate reflection of societal valuations. We were concerned about this for two reasons. One, given the variation between student athletes for reporting attribute levels, we worried that simulated individual willingness to pay would be unlikely to capture broader social valuations. Further, because our study excluded non-athletes, it's not clear whether the preferences we identified would be similar or different for non-athletes. And willingness to pay estimates using our study sample alone would likely not generalize to all students at institutions of higher education. We do think that there are several important implications from this pilot study, but that more work is needed. Institutions can make changes to sexual violence reporting structures that would provide survivors with options that are better aligned with the preferences of student athletes. In particular, our study finds that substance use amnesty policies and higher probabilities of a conduct policy violation could help facilitate student athlete reporting. However, the potential benefits may be isolated to certain student athletes, particularly those without prior SV experiences. We also think it's important to highlight the importance of aligning reporting system attributes with the preferences of sexual violence survivors. People with a history of sexual violence were more likely to choose the opt-out option in the DCE, had lower estimated utility for all attribute levels, and less variation between people. Less than 9% of the student athletes in our sample who experienced sexual violence actually reported it to their institution, which suggests that the DCE evaluations closely mimic the real-world decision for SV survivors, and that these preferences are shared among survivors. University reporting systems originated with Title IX lawsuits and have evolved with the legal landscape. But changes are often made to the legal landscape without the input or a focus on the preferences of those who may want or need to use these reporting systems. Lastly, there's no one-size-fits-all reporting structure based on our study. There were sizable deviations from estimated mean utilities, and preferences differed by several sport-related factors, suggesting that survivors might need options when they approach the reporting decision. There are also some important limitations of our work. As I mentioned, these results may not be generalizable to all student athletes. We included only Division I NCAA member institutions, and our sample underrepresents student athletes who identify as male and student athletes who identify as Black. In addition, more work is needed to understand if similar or different preferences exist in broader student populations who also experience SV at high rates and need to use or want to use these reporting systems. I've provided a list of references, one of which is the today available study of the research I'm presenting today. So if you're interested in reading the paper in more detail, the reference is provided here. And because my work in health risk behaviors and violence exposure, I'm particularly interested in substance use and its intersection with sexual violence. The findings depicted here are a really big part of my ongoing and future work. Sexual violence, as well as dating and intimate partner violence, often co-occur with substance use. And this is not the only study in my work that suggests the importance of substance use amnesty policies. Before we take questions and comments, I want to take just a moment to recognize and appreciate the time and contribution of both current and former student athletes who were open and frank about their experiences, their constraints, and their lives as student athletes. The richness of this work together would be incredibly diminished without their unique perspectives and their insights. Thank you so much for your time and for attending today, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I've also provided my contact information here if you'd like to connect later.
Well, thank you, Alice. It's such an important topic and a very interesting application of ECE. Let's give our audience a little time to type in their questions.